wanted to share some observations that I had on celebrating Passover and now Easter and the connections between those. And the more I've learned about not only the original event of Passover described in Exodus, but the tradition that's continued since then, there's some interesting connections that I saw and learned about. One of the interesting ones is that the practice of creating the whole Passover Seder plate with the different elements is really a symbolic teaching tool for your children so that you can explain to them from a young age what the different things mean. And one of the interesting distinctions is that there's a bone from a lamb to represent the sacrifice of the Passover lamb, which in a Christian view is representative of Jesus, who is the ultimate and final Passover lamb. But to symbolize the other sacrifices that are not for the cleansing or covering of sin, but instead the sacrifices that are made as celebration and part of the feasting, the symbol that they use is an egg. That's a hard-boiled egg, and then it's roasted. So it's roasted to show that it's like the other sacrifices, but rather than using two different bones, which would be confusing, they have these very separate symbols. And as I was reflecting on that, I kept thinking about the symbolism of this egg. And of course, eggs are also symbolic at Easter time, and not probably, people will say that it's something like a sign of fertility, new life, things like that. It does have a kind of a resurrection nature to it in that the egg is born from the chicken, and then the baby chick comes out of the egg, like Jesus coming out of the tomb. And sure, that's a useful symbol. But the thing that was that I was thinking about was in Genesis, when God sends Adam and Eve out of the garden after they sin, and he speaks to the woman and prophesies and says that the seed of a woman will crush the head of a serpent. And looking back, we recognize this as it's called the Proto-Evangelium, and it's the first prophecy of the coming of Christ. And interestingly, it's he calls it the seed of the woman, which is usually translated as like offspring of the woman. But the Hebrew word for seed is the same word when it's translated as seed of a plant, offspring of a human or an animal, and also the male seed or the semen. The same word would be translated that, and depending on the context, you would translate them in different ways. But while there is a understanding and a distinction that happens between those things, and through time, by having a word that has such a loose definition in a way, it's difficult to say like, oh, that's not true, because you'd say like, well, a woman doesn't have a seed like a fruit. Oh yeah, so it's not the same as a fruit seed. But just like fruits have seed, and out of the seed grows new life, a woman gives birth to a child, so the child is like the seed of the woman, and the man deposits his seed into the woman, and that's what causes a child to grow. And in the most ancient thought, that was what they always thought about reproduction, is that the seed came from the man, and that the woman was really just the environment in which that seed would grow into a child. And it's interesting that the Bible, in those very early passages, it speaks with these broad terms they're not technical, so they're not saying something that reflects a misunderstanding. It's perpetually a true statement. A seed is the thing that comes from the other thing. As Jesus said, unless the kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, the new plant will not come forth. And so, in that symbolic kind of way, a seed is just the new life that comes from the old life. But the interesting thing is that while they did not know about biology the same way that we do now, we now know that women do in fact have eggs. And an egg, like an egg from a chicken, is representative of the female seed. It's the female contribution to the life of a child. And so you cannot have just the female or just the male. You need them both. If an egg's not fertilized by a rooster, it will never turn into a chicken. So we know that this is stuff that we learn in middle school now, but their conception of that was unknown. And it's actually interesting because in the Quran, which is later than the Old and New Testament but precedes modern knowledge of such things, they actually did reflect some of their flawed understanding of the time in this description of like how an embryo forms inside of a woman. It's not really accurate, but it reflects their understanding of things at the time, which is interesting in that it's more of a distinct error, I guess you could point out, than the way that things are phrased in the Bible, because the Bible's not reflecting such a technical aspect of things. And so, obviously, when it speaks of the seed of a woman in Genesis, it's referring to Christ who will come, born of a woman. But the interesting thing that I was thinking about is that if we look at what precedes that statement, it's the events of the fall in Genesis. Adam and Eve disobey God's command not to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and because of that, their eyes are open, they become aware. And I spoke a little bit about this in one of my other videos, but really the way, and if in 1,000 years these things are proven to be wrong or some way, it's okay. It's not necessarily proof of exactly how it is. This is just a kind of a heuristic way of thinking about things. But we now understand the concept of epigenetics, that events and environments contribute to a person's genes, and in some aspect those genes can be passed on to the child, even though it's not necessarily written in the DNA. The way the DNA expresses reflects some of those past events. And there's been there's been some famous studies on rats that are very distinct, and there are some other studies where they examine the children who were born from women who experienced famine during World War II, and their children were born with a predisposition toward diabetes and things like that. But if you think about it, they experienced a time where they didn't have enough food, and then their babies have a trait which, if they were to live in a time of famine, would be beneficial because they had a slower metabolism. It was easier for them to gain weight with less food. So because there was such a quick turnaround in events, that wasn't a beneficial trait that they passed on to their children. But if their children had experienced the same environment that their mothers had lived in, it would have been very beneficial indeed. And so the thing about this sort of epigenetic consequence of things is that some environments are so perpetual that we would never be able to distinguish a reversal of those events. I guess in the case of the rats and things like that, they discovered that no matter what, a rat will always have a fear response when it smells the scent of a cat. Cat odor produces fear. Whereas when they did an experiment to associate a certain chemical smell, like based on fruit, odor of fruit, and they would have that smell, and then they would give the rat a shock, that would create a response where the rat would associate that smell with fear. But if they didn't continue to reinforce that, the effect would go away in about 3 to 4 generations. But, so what am I getting at here? The effects of the fall were many faceted. On the one hand, there is the aspect of disobedience to God. There is the effect of a knowledge of good and evil. There is also a discontentment, an idea that the lie that the devil speaks is that God doesn't want man to have the same thing as God, for equality to be grasped, because that would, it's kind of this zero-sum game concept that if you have something, that means I don't have something. And that kind of thing is built into the way we think. It stems from this event. That lie reinforces that idea. And there's several others. And I think as well, some of the learning of deception was kind of encoded in that experience and passed on. And so because all these events are passed on from Adam and Eve to their children, and their children perpetuate the same things, the environment never changes. And so even if it could potentially, these things could go away on their own in a few generations, because it's creating a feedback loop where the effects of their parents' sin causes them to create an environment where they perpetuate the same events, which means that they do the same thing and they pass the same things on to their children. And so that's why you could say whether or not it's necessarily permanently encoded into our DNA, or if it's just a reinforced condition. I don't think we could ever get back to perfection. But I think that there is a sort of truth to this thing, in that we have better and worse societies, better and worse cultures, and a civilization can kind of reach a place where it's its own negative feedback loop, and it's making it impossible for it to escape the consequences of its actions. But when we have events that shake up things like cultures and civilizations, sometimes it can kind of break those habits. That's the Tower of Babel. Everybody was in a place all together, reinforcing each other's negative responses to things, and there was no way for them to escape that from within that, and that's why God had to split them apart, and then they can develop separately in good ways. And a really interesting example of this is grasshoppers and locusts, because grasshoppers and locusts are exactly the same creature. They're hatched from the same eggs, they come from the same parents, but the only difference is that if a grasshopper is spawned in an area where it has enough space to roam freely and explore as it will continue to be a grasshopper. But when too many eggs spawn in the same area, and you have too large of a concentration of young larval grasshoppers, they actually develop differently. They have the same DNA, but the way that DNA expresses, the genes that it chooses to express, change, and they turn into locusts instead, which is a group of grasshoppers that acts like a cohesive unit. It's a swarm mode. And so instead of having individual grasshoppers, you have a swarm of locusts, and the swarm is like one entity. So if you think about that, like that's kind of like the Tower of Babel story. Everybody was clumped together in this place, and they they were just feeding off each other's energy in such a way that they, even as the children grow and develop, they're not going to reach the full potential because they need a break from that environment to really grow the way that God intended them to. And so I think you can also see that when civilizations collapse and different events cause scattering of people and things like that, we perhaps look at it as like, look at the devastation of what happened, but providentially God is keeping something worse from happening if those people were not separated. Now, how does this relate to an Easter egg or a Betzah egg from the Passover plate? Well, the interesting thing that we didn't know about biology at the time that was written is that a woman does indeed have eggs, much like a chicken's eggs, and that is the genetic contribution that she makes to a child. However, unlike a chicken who produces new eggs on a regular basis, all of a woman's eggs are created in the womb as she is developing, very early on in the womb, in fact. And then they stay at a relatively dormant state until they are each individually released by the body after puberty, when the woman's ready to bear children. And the interesting thing about these eggs is that the eggs are relatively or almost totally unaffected by epigenetic changes. So they don't undergo change based on environment or effects or trauma. They are like literally in a kind of a stasis, hidden away. And so as I talked about the fact that, I believe that some of the female aspect of God is present in Jesus, in that the female is hidden within the male and Eve is taken out of Adam, because a female is being female is a recessive trait. You need to get the female chromosome from both your father and your mother. But that means that all males have a female chromosome. So it's hidden, that it doesn't express in a male because you need two for it to express, but it's still present in a male DNA. So Adam was, in a sense, both male and female, because all males are male and female. All women are female and female. This is the XY versus the XX chromosome. And so just as Eve was, in a sense, hidden in Adam, in other words, the information to create an Eve was physically encoded in Adam's genetic information, so also a woman's eggs are, in a sense, the future generation hidden within her body. And Eve, being a fully developed woman at the time of the fall event, her genes were changed. And Adam's genes were changed because of this experience that they had. They ate something, it affected their physical DNA. That's why the verse in Romans about Adam is true. Romans 5:12, where it says, "Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned." It's saying that the genetic consequences of Adam's sin are passed on through Adam. Why not through Eve? She ate the fruit first. Is it because she was deceived? In a sense, that's part of it. But in actuality, what Eve passed on to her children was an uncorrupted set of genes that were unaffected by the consequences of her eating that fruit. Now, as a child develops in the womb, the mother does have her environment and her actions do have an epigenetic consequence. And in fact, that was the result of that study about the Dutch women in World War II, that because they had experienced that, and that became part of their genes, and therefore they passed it on during the development stage of the embryo, or because they were pregnant while that was happening, and it got passed on perhaps even more strongly, there is an effect. But the genes themselves from the egg are uncorrupted. However, as a man's reproductive systems work, new sperm is being created on a regular basis. And so whatever changes are present in the male's DNA and these epigenetic consequences of that, of his environment and his actions and the things that happen to him, they get passed on almost immediately. So because all children had Adam as a father, they could not help but receive from him a corrupted set of genes. But from Eve's side, it was uncorrupted. And because of the way that the eggs develop in the womb, they developed very early on. So for all of the daughters that Eve had, they would come from an egg that was uncorrupted. Now, the other half of their genes from Adam was corrupted. But as they developed, the eggs, and it's about a 50-50 chance whose X chromosome is in that, because each egg only has one. It doesn't have two. Each egg had a 50-50 chance of also receiving an uncorrupted set of genes, or at least as far as the sex chromosomes are concerned. And so, and because it happened so early on in the development, the epigenetic time, the time in which that development is subject to change, is very brief and very small, and it may not even be an affected part, really, because of the way these things work. So in a sense, the amount of time that the male line of descent is exposed to environmental changes is the whole time from birth or development in the womb until that child grows to adulthood and passes on their seed. And depending on how old they are, there's more consequential information passed on, in a sense. Which is really interesting, because when you think about the patriarchs in the Old Testament, many of the children who inherited were not the firstborn, because the firstborn has a very inexperienced father. But a lot of times it was when the patriarch was in their old age that they had a son, and that son, in a sense, inherits the wisdom of the father. Even though it doesn't really work that way, there is an aspect where it's true. And so in a sense, and that's what happens through the male line. But through the female line, it's almost the exact opposite, where a woman gets pregnant and her embryo develops, if it's a female, develops those eggs in a very short amount of time, and then they stay that way until that woman grows up and becomes a mother. And then every time she has a daughter, it's the same thing. There's a very brief window of development. So in 2,000 years on the male line, you have 2,000 years worth of consequential actions affecting the way that those genes are expressed. But on the female line, you have maybe a couple weeks for each generation. And so the amount of environmental change that occurs from Eve until Mary is like basically a few years or something like that. It's such a drastically reduced amount of time. And if you think about even the cultures that were happening there, first of all, God promised first to the woman that it would be her seed that would crush the head of the serpent. And so there was a hopeful anticipation every time a woman became pregnant. And so that is the emotional context that those children are born into. And especially when it's a child of promise. So if you think about like Isaac developing in Sarah's womb, and how much wonder she had at that experience, and the positive emotions and the positive things that were being passed on to her child. And then and Isaac was a son, so that helped his character in a sense, perhaps, but these things matter. And so but every hopeful woman, as she had a daughter growing in her, that daughter was in sense inheriting that hopeful spirit and the general positivity that these cultures had towards pregnancy and family and all these things would benefit that child. And now today, there's so much anti-natalist stuff going on, and that will have a consequence. Even if a child is carried to term, and even if a child is wanted by his family, it's hard to say like, oh, exactly this is how it works, but these things all matter, and they all have an effect. And so if a woman is saying like, thinking, is this responsible that I'm bringing another child into the world, those thoughts are going to have an impact on that child. But those were not the thoughts that were happening almost anywhere thousands and thousands of years ago. And so, in a sense, when you think about it, the way this stuff works, there is kind of like a Bene-Gesserit breeding program going through the history of the Old Testament. And as God brings all these women into the fold, we don't know exactly what, but they are contributing something on a genetic level, at an epigenetic level, that is good, and it contributes to the place where we get to Mary, who God chose her, and that's important. But this genealogical background has an important part to play, and somehow Mary came to that place where her genetic contribution to Christ was the correct mixture, the correct set of genes that God needed for Christ to be able to accomplish what he needed. Wherein, because it's not an inherited guilt, but it's an inherited predilection towards sin, Christ may not have had that predilection, or it may have been so much weaker than it is for a normal person that he was able to, in faithful obedience, live a sinless life, something that, the rest of us are not capable of. And, it's not something that's written about necessarily, but the more we learn about nature, biology, things like that, how things work, these are the details that make it plausible to see how God could do that within nature. And this is not to say that, this is a materialistic explanation of things, because that's a really unhelpful distinction. Because God didn't, God created what he created, and he created it the way that he wanted to. And he said that it was good and very good. And to think that he has to always be breaking his rules to accomplish anything it's just, that's more or less to say that God made a bunch of mistakes that he has to fix. But he doesn't have to fix mistakes. He created the things the way he created them. And there was some part of that creation that did not suffer corruption the way that the rest of it did. And though every girl that was born, though they had that incorruptible seed in them, it was hidden, and it was not expressed, because the other half of their nature, what they receive from their father, covers it over. The way that any presence of a Y chromosome means that a child will be a male. So in the same way, any expression of corrupted, sinful nature will be expressed. But in Christ, he did not have a biological father. And so, however the way that the conception by the Holy Spirit occurs, it's very possible that Mary had an uncorrupted set of genes that she was able to contribute to that. So that Jesus Christ was a man formed, in a sense, from Adam, because Eve was taken out of Adam, and yet bypassed the sin and the corruption that occurred at the fall, because that half of the DNA was unaffected and hidden away within Eve's body. So, this is speculative, of course, but I think it's worth thinking about, and it kind of points to Grimgriz's idea of a shadow matriarchy, and at the head of that is God, who's really the one directing things. And he switched things around when it came to the time of Abraham, because then everybody looked at the male line of descent, because it was Abraham's seed. But that doesn't, the physical culmination of Abraham's line, in a sense, was a woman, in that it was the mother of Jesus. And then it was not the seed of Abraham per se that impregnated Mary, however it worked through the Holy Spirit. That's, I'm not going to say there's biological explanations for everything, but there is a kind of a way that you can think about this thing working, that at least the contribution that came from Eve to Mary was not the line through which sin was inherited. That came through Adam's line. And so that's something to think about, I think. And I think this kind of goes with my thing of, we as Protestants make not enough of Mary, but the Catholics make too much, because she didn't have to be sinless and perfect, and the birth of Jesus didn't have to happen in a miraculous, painful way. Mary didn't have to be conceived in perfection, because the part that she contributed to Jesus's genetics could remain uncorrupted, even through the natural order of things. And it does not require a special miracle other than the miracle of Jesus' conception. So we don't need a immaculate conception of Mary, or Mary being a sinless person, or any of these things. And to me, I mean, as I said in my previous video about Mary, I think this makes a more compelling story, because it doesn't mean that Mary is this perfect person, an unattainable representation of feminine virtue. It means that God can do miraculous things through normal people. I'm saying she probably was a very good person, and if she inherited less corrupt genes through this process, that probably would have helped her to be less of a sinful person. But I don't think that there's anything wrong with saying that a woman fulfilling the role that God created women to do, to get married, bear children, raise them, teach them well, Mary contributed all those things, and that is something that any woman can aspire to do, those things. Those are some of my thoughts. It's kind of connecting Christmas to Easter, but through the symbolism of that egg. So hopefully that was helpful, and let me know what you think.